To start off, Asia, can you talk about what the main function of the Office of the Chief Actuary is?
So the Office of the Chief Actuary provides the independent valuation services and advisory services to the federal government. It includes the statutory actuarial valuations for such program as the Canada Pension Plan, Old Age Security, Canada Student Financial Assistance Program, Employment Insurance Program, as well as the public sector pension and insurance plans, including benefits to veterans. So as you can see, we cover a very wide range of programs, and I probably should say that they cover every almost single Canadian age 18 and over. Like, for example, for the Canada Pension Plan, the number of members is 23 million. For the Employment Insurance Program, it's 20 million. So these are big, big numbers, as you can see.
Wow.
So the majority of our actuarial reports, they are statutory, so they're prescribed by legislation and they're tabled in Parliament by an appropriate minister. And I have a very kind of dual situation within the Office of Superintendent of Financial Institutions where we're located. I report to the superintendent, but I am solely responsible for the content and actuarial opinions of our reports. So, and basically our work is for informing the politicians, the parliamentarians, the public of the financial status of the plans and the risks these programs are facing.
That's really interesting. So sorry, Mark. I just have a quick follow-up question. So it sounds like there's quite a bit of independence for your office to do the work that you have to do.
Yes, there is quite a lot of independence, and this independence is kind of enshrined in the legislation and the fact that we do work for the departments and we're located outside of all these departments. There are other safeguards to our independence. For example, our report for the Canada Pension Plan is reviewed by independent actuaries, and they pronounce themselves on the reasonableness of our assumptions, methodologies, and many other things.
And what's the main purpose of the actuarial report on the Canada Pension Plan?
So for Canada Pension Plan, we produce the actuarial report every 3 years. It's more than 200 pages document. So if you have time, welcome to read it. You can find it on our website, but it contains the wealth of information. And the main purpose is to determine the minimum contribution rates so that can sustain the plan. After we, like both components of the plan, because the Canada Pension Plan, as you may know, has two components, the base plan, which was the benefits in existence prior to 2019, and the additional plan, which is the enhancement that was enacted in 2019. So we determine these minimum contribution rates and we compare these rates with the legislated contribution rates. Just to remind you, for the base CPP, the legislated contribution rate is 9.9% on earnings up to the year maximum pensionable earnings, which are about 70,000 in the 2024. And for the additional CPP, these contribution rates are 2% up to YMP, like year maximum pensionable earnings, we called it YMP, and another 8% between YMP and additional YMP, which is 14% higher than YMP. So we compare these two rates, the rates that we determine and the rates that are prescribed by legislation, and if the rates that we determine, if they are lower than the legislated rates, the plans are deemed to be sustainable. So in addition to the minimum legislated rates, I said, like the report contains the wealth of information. We project the contributors, contributions, beneficiaries, expenditures, assets, and all this information serves as a basis of the triennial review of the pension plan, of the Canada Pension Plan by federal, provincial, territorial ministers of finance, the stewards of the CPP. So in addition, of course, we inform the plan members on the financial status of the plan. And once again, let me repeat that the report is tabled in Parliament by the Minister of Finance.
I do want to mention that the report, just for listeners, the report is actually fascinating. Like it really is an interesting read. There is a ton of ton of good information in there.
I'm curious, Asya, what outcome of the report would trigger a change in the contribution or benefit rates?
Basically, and I will talk about base CPP because additional CPP is not mature enough, but it's true for additional CPP as well. If we show the minimum contribution rate, which is higher than legislated contribution rate, actually for additional CPP, it's falling outside some prescribed ranges. So the Minister of Finance need to decide what to do, how they're going to address the situation. Like the many of their options is to change the contribution rate, to change benefits, to do both, or actually to do nothing, as long as they reach an agreement. And they reach an agreement if 2/3 of the provinces covering 2/3 of the population agree on the course of action. So this is their role. If they don't reach their agreement, this is where the things are becoming interesting because the legislation has so-called the self-sustaining mechanism. And if they don't reach an agreement and the trigger in the report happens, then certain actions occur. For the base CPP, it's the increase in contribution rate and freezing of the indexation and benefits. And for additional CPP, it's also changing indexation, changing accrual and benefits, and as a last resort, increase in the contribution rate. But once again, like self-adjustment mechanism, self-sustaining mechanism, they are kind of the safety net, basically coming into place if politicians cannot agree on the course of action. What also can happen, there may be changes to the plan if the minimum contribution rates are actually lower than the legislated contribution rate. This is normally done when there is a sufficient margin between the rates that we determine and the legislated contribution rates. And the plans need to be modernized to be better aligned with the labor market and retirement behavior of Canadians.
So how common is it for the actuarial report to actually result in changes to benefits or contribution rates?
Not very common. I should say that over the last more than 20 years, from 2023, the legislated rate stayed at 9.9%. And in every single report, we showed the minimum contribution rate less than 9.9%. And over the last couple of reports, less than the contribution rates for the additional CPP. However, the benefits were changed. Like several years ago, the benefits were changed to introduce, for example, the post-retirement disability benefits for early retirees and to remove some reduction in the survivor benefits for younger survivors. Going back in history, in 2009, a major reforms package was introduced when people were allowed to work after retirement and still continue to earn the CPP benefits. And this was a major thing because it's really kind of aligned with the retirement behavior of Canadians. So changes happen, but normally the changes happen, as I said, to align better the plan with the reality of the Canadian realities. And every time the changes happen, the cost implication of these changes are very extensively discussed. And I should say that the governance mechanism of the plan with the federal provincial discussions, the requirement of agreements of the 2/3 of the provinces with 2/3 of the populations make imprudent changes very unlikely.
So a lot of those changes you just mentioned sounded like enhancements. Is that correct? Yeah.
Yeah.
Interesting. And Asya, what are the main revenue sources for CPP?
So both base and additional CPP are financed by the contributions that are paid in the equal measure by employers and employees, 50-50, and by investment income. So CPP fund which you probably hear quite a lot about it in the news, is a segregated fund. It's totally segregated from the government, and it's governed by its own legislation. So it's totally arm's length from the government. Its mandate, it's invested by the organization which is called the Canada Pension Plan Investments. And its mandate is to invest the money in the sole interest of contributors and beneficiaries. So as of March 31st, 2024, the fund was 632 billion. So I like to digest this number, 632 billion. It's a very large number. And about 94% of this fund was in respect to the base CPP and 6% with respect to additional CPP, which is in a very early stage of its existence and currently is maturing.
I'm curious, how much of the base CPP benefit payments are funded by contributions versus investment income?
We speak today. The contributions to the base CPP fully cover the payments outgoing payments from the plan. So basically, the whole investment income, as we speak now, stays in the fund. We projected by 2030, about 9% of investment income will be needed to pay for the benefits. And this number is projected to increase to 16% by 2050. So even then, a large portion of the investment income still will stay in the fund and will be invested.
What is the funded status of base CPP?
Oh, this is an expression that I don't like, funded status. And to answer your question, let's go a little bit in history. Let's go a little bit in history and talk about the financing, like a history of financing of the plan. So, as you know, the plan was introduced in 1966 as a pay-as-you-go plan with very small reserve. When I'm saying pay-as-you-go, it means that the contributions are supposed to cover the benefits. Basically, what we collect, we pay out. So over the years, the contributions were increased, the benefits were improved, and we ended up by 1997, which is a plan with very small reserve for 36 million, not billions, millions, 36 millions. And the prediction by the chief actuary at that time that the contribution rates need to increase to more than 14% by 2030. So then in 1997, the major reform was introduced. And main features of these reforms, the contribution rate was gradually increased to 9.9%. But what was also very important, it was decided to create the Canada Pension Plan Investment Board and to invest the excess of contributions on the markets, not needed to pay benefits in the markets. So today, the base CPP is a partially funded social insurance program. So contributions still play an extremely important role in the life of the base CPP. Right now, 70% of the total revenues of the plan are coming from contributions and only 30% from investment income. So as you understand, it's contributions is the main source of revenues, and we project that it will continue. So the plan is financed using approach is called steady state approach. And sorry, I'm getting a little bit technical here, but I think it's important to understand.
Yeah. No,
and this is the approach which is basically stabilize the ratio of assets to the expenditure. So it looks how many years of expenditure can be paid from the actual existing asset. And this approach is supposed to stabilize this level. So another thing that was introduced in the 1997 report, that all new benefits are supposed to be fully funded. And when we're talking about fully funded, we're talking about that the present value of future contributions related to these benefits should be equal to present value of future benefits. So basically, why I'm telling you all this, the base CPP is a social contract. It's not your regular defined benefit pension plan. It's a social contract. And you today, as a young people, and I think you're all younger than I am, allow today to take your contributions and pay benefits to the current contributor, to current beneficiaries. But you're doing this in exchange and with understanding. When you need the benefits, the future contributors will will do the same. They will pay for your benefits from their contributions. So what it means in practice, when we assess the sustainability of the base CPP and the additional CPP as well, we need to consider the contributions and benefits of future contributors and future retirees. So saying that, the fully funded or funded status as understood by the private pension plans is not really applicable to the base CPP, and base CPP was never intended to be fully funded in this sense. If you're interested, once again, in the degree of pre-funding, I think it's nice to look at the ratio of the importance of the investment income for the plan. And as I said, today it's 30%, and we project by 2050 to be about 40% of the total revenues coming from investment income and 60% still coming from the contributions.
Okay, that's really interesting. So base CPP is not designed to be fully funded.
No, it's not designed. It's a partially funded program.
Okay.
And I should tell you that basically, if you look around the world, I think I probably know one social security program which is so-called fully funded and which is located in the Middle East. The rest of the programs, they are either partially funded or pay as you go.
Yeah, interesting. Makes sense. You mentioned this briefly, but I want to come back to it to make sure the listeners understand. Can you talk about how funding is different for base CPP and additional CPP?
Yes, additional CPP. When additional CPP was introduced, it's basically the idea is that the generations are paid for their benefits as they earned. So it was achieved through the fact that the money were invested in the market right way. That the link between benefits and contributions was strengthened, and the benefits were accrued gradually. So if we look at and right now the plan is not mature, so let's not look at the plan right now, because right now contributions, of course, constitute a huge part of the revenues because there is a very small fund. But at maturity, the investment income will constitute about 70% of the revenues. So basically it's inverse with respect to the base CPP.
And as of the last actuarial report, how sustainable is base CPP at the current contribution rate?
I have good news for you. It's sustainable for the next 75 years. We determined the minimum contribution rate that we determine is 9.54%, which is quite lower than 9.9% of the legislated rate. And if we talk about the asset to expenditure ratio, right now it stands at 8, and it's projected to increase to 11% to 2050 under the legislated contribution rates. And we also project that the asset will reach 1.2 trillion in today's dollars by 2050. So 1.2 trillion in today's dollars.
I don't know, guys, but that all sounds pretty good to me.
Sounds good.
And how sustainable is additional CPP?
Additional CPP is sustainable as well. Like the minimum contribution rates are slightly lower than the legislated contribution rates. And at maturity, we expect that the asset to expenditure ratio will stabilize at the level of about 25-26. And we project the asset to be reached by 2050 to 800 billion in today's dollars.
Wow.
Yeah, those are
So think about 2 trillion in the asset
Wow.
total.
yeah, those are big numbers.
These are big
Um,
numbers, but these are good news. These are all good news.
Yeah.
Yeah, sounds like really, really good news. You've mentioned the minimum contribution rate. When we're talking about plan sustainability, how is that being measured? Like, what is the metric that says, yes, this is sustainable?
It includes a lot of mathematics. I'll try to kind of describe it in the high level. So basically, what we do for the base CPP, we find the minimum rate that first of all, there are 2 components to the minimum contribution rate. There is a steady state rate and full funding rate. And right now, the steady state rate is 9.53, and the delta, which is a very small amount, is the full funding rate. So what we do to determine the minimum contribution, the steady state contribution rate, we stabilize asset and expenditure ratio in 2 points in time, which is the right now in 2 years, which are 50 years apart. Today, this year is at 2034 and 2084. For additional CPP, it's a little bit more complex model, but basically we are sure we find the stable minimum contribution rate such that basically there are enough contributions and investment income to pay for benefits. And I can go to the complex mathematical explanation, but I don't think it's probably will be very interesting for your listeners. If you're interested, we can go and look at our report.
Fair enough. What are the main assumptions that go into the sustainability analysis at a high level?
A lot of assumptions. First of all, I mentioned in the beginning that we'll work with CPP covers all workers and retirees in Canada except Quebec. So basically what we need to start with is to project the population of Canada and population of Quebec. And to do that, we make assumptions about the fertility, the migration rates, as well as mortality rates.
Wow.
Yes. So after we project the population, we need to project the labor force, because basically the population of contributors and then eventually beneficiaries is based on the labor force. So we make assumptions regarding the labor force participation rate, unemployment rate. We make assumptions about earnings growth and earnings distribution. And then eventually we make assumptions about the retirement behavior of Canadians. When do they retire? Do they work after retirement? And so on. So, and finally, last but not least, we make assumptions about returns on the assets invested by the CPP investments. So the report is more than 200 pages, which describes a lot of these assumptions. So once again, you're welcome to read the report. But I should also say that the report has a very nice 2-page executive summary, which kind of can give you an idea of what's going on with the plan.
The executive summary is great. My favorite part of the report, though, is the sensitivity analysis at the end, and we're going to ask some questions about that in a minute. But that stuff's a lot of fun to read.
So, how do you approach making best estimate assumptions for the projections?
It's a mixture of science and art, because we make assumptions for the next 75 years. So of course we don't have crystal balls. Nobody knows what will happen over 75 years. So what we do, we look at the past trends. We examine them very carefully. We look at the existing environments. We look at the emerging trends, like for example, climate change or AI or geopolitical tensions. And we kind of decide to which extent these trends are going to continue, both past and emerging. We apply mathematical models, and then at the end of the day, we apply judgment. And this is how we make the assumptions. And you see, our reports are every 3 years, so our assumptions are self-correct. Like every 3 years, we reflect the experience of what is happening and see how well our assumptions are aligned with the reality. And I should tell you, I'm pretty proud about it. Like our mortality assumptions over last, this last 3 years, but last 3 years prior report were almost bang on.
Wow.
Except COVID, of course.
Yeah, right. That is very cool. What information sources are you drawing from when you start making all these assumptions?
Yes, we do our own research. We look at the papers. We look at the relevant papers. We consult with our colleagues at the different government departments and at the outside organizations such as Statistic Canada, Conference Board of Canada, Department of Finance, investment boards. Like in the beginning of each triennial review, we organize the interdisciplinary seminar where we consult with the demography, economy, and investment experts. One of such seminars is this coming September. And when we develop our assumptions, we present these assumptions as well to specialists just to check for their reasonableness. Saying all this, the ultimate responsibility for the assumptions rests with the chief actuary. So as I mentioned before, I'm solely responsible for the assumptions going and for the actuarial conclusion going in our report. What we also do, I also mentioned it before, we have the independent peer review. That part of this independent peer review process is to opine on the reasonableness of our assumptions. And we had so far 9 independent peer reviewers, and every time they opine that our assumptions are within the reasonable range.
And how do you estimate expected returns for the assets that are managed by CPP Investments?
And it's an interesting question. It's because it's one of the most complicated assumptions to develop. As you can understand, CPP employ active investment strategies, but we do not develop the assumptions on active investment strategy. Like according to our actuarial standards, and we're governed by actuarial standards, we look at the kind of semi-passive equivalent of their investment strategy. So we develop the assumptions for the wider classes, such as a private and public equity, fixed income, credit, real asset. After we develop these assumptions, and very often they are so-called select and ultimate, so they are variable for the first, say, 10 years, and then they gradually converge to their ultimate value when we have more uncertainty. And you should understand that when we come to CPP Investment, for example, and ask them what is their long-term assumptions, their long-term is 5 years. Mm-hmm. For us, long-term is 75 years. So really, we need to apply a lot of judgment. And even when we go to any investment board or any investment forecast, for investors, long-term it's 5-10 years. It's uncomparable with what we project. So after we develop the assumptions by the class, we apply the asset allocation to these assumptions, and we adjust them for the investment returns. Something that need to be mentioned about respect to the asset allocation, that base CPP and additional CPP have 2 different asset allocations. It's kind of related to the fact that they have very different sensitivity to the investment returns. So this is how we approach it, and we have internally 3 people working almost full time on the kind of understanding of the investment.
Wow. Wow. And what are your expected return assumptions for the assets held by the CPP?
So in last CPP report, we assumed the average 75-year return of 5.9% for the base CPP. and 5.4% for the additional CPP. And once again, additional CPP is invested, let me say, more conservatively with less risk than the base CPP.
Yeah, super interesting. We also prepare expected return assumptions for financial planning for our clients, and I sit on the projection assumption guidelines committee with FP Canada, and we actually use your numbers as one of the inputs. But it is a very complex exercise, and even we project financial plans, maybe not at 75 years, maybe sometimes close to that though. And plans are so sensitive to small changes, so it's scary stuff. Your job is very scary.
Oh, very soon we will be reaching out to you to ask what are your projections.
Yeah, we post them online. You can you can
Okay,
see them.
yes. Thank you for letting me know. It's an additional source of information.
Yeah. How sensitive is the sustainability of the plan to realized returns being lower than the expected returns that we just talked about?
The scary part.
Yeah.
Yes, and when you say realized returns, let's talk about kind of couple of things. First of all, there are realized returns, which is experience. And the second part is what we assume for the long term.
Right.
So I will give you an example for the base CPP. For example, if for example, as of last report, the asset would be 10% lower than actual asset, then the minimum contribution rate would be 17 percentage points higher. So instead of 9.54, it would be, oh my God, my mathematics. It would be 9.71. 9.71. For the additional CPP, right now, additional CPP is not very sensitive because once again, the assets is very, very small, but it will be very sensitive to that, more sensitive than the base CPP when it matures. Now, how sensitive is the plan to our assumptions is another question. Very sensitive. So one of the tests that we do, for example, we take the assumed rate of return, which is determined as the 90th percentile. So basically, we assume at 90% of cases, the plan will return more than we assume, which is quite an extreme test, I should say. And by pure coincidence, when I round these returns, it's 4.1 for the both components of the plan. Once again, pure coincidence. And if we assume that the plan will earn 4.1 over the long term, the minimum contribution rate for the base CPP will be 11.22%, which, as you can see, it's extremely sensitive. For the base CPP, for the additional CPP, it will be 2.86%, the first minimum contribution rate, which probably doesn't sound as scary, but considering that the legislated contribution rate is 2%, is 43% increase in the contribution rate. So as I said, because the additional CPP is so much more sensitive to investment income, there are so much more, the importance of investment income is so much more, the sensitivity is much higher.
Wow. So it's very sensitive to the returns. How sensitive is it to other variables like fertility, mortality, migration, labor force?
The sensitivity really depends on the type of financing of the base CPP and additional CPP. Base CPP is sensitive to all three demographic variables. I will not bombard you with the numbers, but it's sensitive to immigration and fertility. Both components of the plans are sensitive to mortality, which is like, if you think about it, the longer people live, the longer they draw benefits. It's true for any single pension plan. So if, for example, we assume that people live 2 years longer than best estimate assumptions, the minimum contribution rate for the base CPP will increase by 32 basis points. And for additional CPP, it will be 15 basis points. Finally, labor market wage growth. This is very interesting very interesting assumptions because base CPP and additional CPP react differently to the movement of the real wage or like wage growth assumptions. For the base CPP, it affects contributions right away, and eventually it will affect the expenditures. So the higher is the real wage increase, the lower is the cost for the base CPP. The relationship is reverse it's inverse for the additional CPP. Because once again, because I said the investment income is so much more important, and this relationship for additional CPP is much closer to the actually what's happened in the traditional defined benefit pension plans. The higher is the real wage, the more the additional CPP will cost.
Mm.
So if we just take base CPP, for example, is it possible to say which of all those variables that we just talked about, including investment returns, which one of them is the plan most sensitive to? Like which one, variation in which of those variables matters the most to the outcome of the plan?
It's hard to say. You see, like it's hard to say measure sensitivity because sensitivity is in the eyes of beholder. Like it's how we determine the sensitivity test. But I would say that probably investment income, mortality, and real wage are these are kind of economic growth. These are kind of sensitive, like the most sensitive variables. Keep in mind also that demography normally, unless you have COVID, is a slower developing variables. It's very rarely we have shocks. While we can have quite significant shocks on the investment fronts as well as recessions on the economic environment.
Just on that, how does lower overall economic growth affect plan sustainability?
Once again, we do the test on the low economic growth, and when I talk about low economic growth, I talk about the lower labor market participation rate, higher unemployment, lower wage growth, and of course, for base CPP, as I said, it's affected negatively. It's increased. The test that we do increase the base CPP contribution rate to 10.12%, which is higher than 9.9%. Talking about these scenarios, I think you should keep in mind that these are not predictions. Our projections are the best estimate. These are just illustrations. And so you shouldn't really take this as a face value. It's an illustration of how the different reality can affect the pension, the CPP.
Makes sense. How does it change in the income distribution, like a widening gap between the low earners and high earners? How does that affect sustainability of the plan?
Guys, you really read the report really well. I can feel that you're going by the tests that that we have prepared in your questions. Yes, we did the test. Like if I can basically say increase in inequality. Like right now, like under the best estimate assumptions, we assume the stable distribution of earnings and earners. So we basically assume that the gap in the earnings between the low earners and high earners stays more or less constant. If we assume that this gap will be widening, this will cost CPP big time. And the reason for that is because if you remember, CPP doesn't cover the full earnings. It's cover only earnings up to a certain limit. So if you increase earnings over this limit, the contributions are not flowing to the plan. So the plan will become more costly.
So what you mentioned climate change earlier. How do you model the potential impacts of something like that?
Yes, last report was the first report we started to kind of dip our toes into this very complex topic. And I should say that I'm proud, very proud of the office, because we're almost the first ones in the world who started to look at the impact of the climate change on the sustainability of the social security programs. And if you think about it, the climate can affect the plan for different channels. It can affect for demographic channels, impacts on mortality, impacts on migration, think about climate refugees. It can it can also impact the plan for the macroeconomic channels like the economic growth, investment returns, and so on. And impacts could come from the physical risks, such as chronic risks, such like the increase in the temperature, rising sea levels, or through the acute risks, such as extreme weather events, storms, heat waves, the fires. We all heard this recent tragic news about Jasper.
Mm-hmm.
Like I almost cried. I loved this little city so much and spent a lot of my youth hiking around that. So it's so sad. So last report decided to start to look what can happen, and we decided not to look at the demographic variables because there is a lot of uncertainty. And instead of that, we started to look at the impacts on the GDP. This is the variable which is very often modeled in the different sources, such as NGFS and other sources, how the GDP will be impacted. The challenge, of course, is to translate the impacts of GDP to the labor market and investment impacts. So what we have done, we reviewed a number of sources, mostly public, some private sources, and we developed the three transition scenarios: the successful transition, orderly transition, the failed transition, the disorderly transition, and the failed transition. And we translated the impacts on GDP to the labor market through the increase in the real wage increase. And we also translated the impacts through the returns on equities.
Wow.
So the results, I see you shaking your head. Yes, it's pretty
incredible. That's just an unbelievable modeling exercise.
Yes, it is. It is a quite complex exercise. Of course, we simplified a lot because you see, we're not climate scientists. But once again, these illustrations, and what I also need to mention, very purposefully, we made these downside scenarios. We didn't consider the impacts of new technologies, of emerging business opportunities. So they're purely downside scenarios, like illustration of potential downside risks. So what we found that under disorderly transition and failed transition, in both cases, the minimum contribution rate exceeded 9.9%. So the impacts are quite important, I should say. So we continue the work. We are working right now on an actuarial study where we're looking at the demographic risks and a little bit more in depth, diving into the macroeconomic and investment risks. Basically, the goal of this exercise is to determine what we are going to do for the upcoming actuarial report, because ideally, I would love to include the climate in the best estimate assumptions, but there's so much uncertainty. So much depending on the climate policy, and they change almost every day. So I'm not sure. I'm pretty sure we'll stay with scenarios. I'm giving you a little spoiler alert.
So speaking of uncertainty, and you've mentioned the pandemic a couple of times, like how do events like that affect the way you approach your projections?
Yes, the kind of this catastrophic events like pandemic, they definitely disrupt the time series, the historic data. So for many variables, such as, for example, migration, in our analysis, we need to exclude pandemic year from our analysis, because if you think about it, the border closed. So there were no migration. If we will take these years as a part of our analysis, it would really disrupt the results. But what is much more interesting is mortality, of course. What was not clear with mortality, is it the systemic shift or just the outlier? Because what we don't really know to which extent COVID would impact the long-term mortality. What are the long-term impacts on our health? What are the long-term impacts that will emerge probably several decades after the pandemic? And we still don't know the answer to this question. And I think scientists don't know it either. It will require much more experience and much more research to do that. So what we decided to do, we decided to treat it a little bit like the outlier and decided to assume that the basically mortality will return to the pre-pandemic path. But it was a very interesting exercise, and it took us a lot of thinking and consulting, we talked a lot to our counterpart in US, for example, what do they think about it, to our counterpart in Europe. So very interesting times from point of modeling and from point of, I should say, research.
Mm-hmm. Wow. So there's an incredible amount of testing and scenario testing and sensitivity analysis that you guys do. And I'm curious, in all of these scenarios that you run, how frequently does the minimum contribution rate exceed the current legislated contribution rate?
The answer to this question actually depends very much at which level is the minimum contribution rate under the best estimate assumptions. If it's close to 9.9, then of course you will have a lot of tests where we will have rate exceeding 9.9. In the last report, the minimum contribution rate is quite low. So we had only few tests when under sensitivity that the rate was higher than 9.9%. And I think I mentioned them like low long-term investment return, low economic growth, and 2 climate scenarios.
Yeah, really, really interesting. Okay, Asia, we've got 2 more questions for you. The last one's about you. The second to last one I'm going to ask now. I'll give you some quick background, though. One of the reasons that we wanted to talk to you is that we did a few podcast episodes earlier this year on Canada Pension Plan and why it's a really valuable asset and why it's a good thing for Canadians. And we got a lot of feedback from our audience, from people saying that, well, CPP is not going to be there. It's gonna collapse, and comments like that. So obviously, who better than you, literally in the world, to talk to you about that? So, what would you say to people who are skeptical of CPP's future sustainability?
CPP is an excellent financial health, and I should say it's also an excellent governance health. Right now, like as I said, we estimate that financially CPP is sound for the next 75 years. And the current governance process, the triennial reviews, regular triennial reviews, and the self-adjustment mechanism, they really guarantee that no imprudent decisions are going to be made with respect to the CPP. So what I will tell to the people, if you do your retirement planning, please count CPP as one of the major retirement income source for your retirement. And CPP is my passion. As long as I'm in the office, I promise you that we will do very thorough financial review of the CPP. And I'm sure my successors are going to do the same as my predecessors.